prairie folks laughed and told him that cabin was cursed, too ugly to be safe, too strange to be real. A worn-out veteran in a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket ignored them anyway because he'd already survived louder storms than gossip. He dug into a hillside outside Great Falls, Montana, built walls thick enough to shame the wind, and gave his loyal German Shepherd Ranger a place to sleep without shivering. Then the sky turned mean. When the first savage blast of winter hit, the normal cabins started bleeding heat like open wounds. The laughter died. And when Ranger began barking into the white-out ears, pinned nose working, pulling his veteran toward the drifting dark neighbors they once called friends, came stumbling out of the storm on the edge of freezing. They reached the ugly cabin and found it glowing warm like a hearth guarded by old gods. Inside, the temperature stayed near 70 degrees, while the world outside tried to kill them. What happened in those 5 days would flip a whole community's pride upside down and turn the town's biggest joke into the only reason some families lived to see spring. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments because it's wild how far these winter stories travel. Winter arrived early in Great Falls, Montana, with a sky the color of old steel and a wind that scraped the prairie clean, carrying cold that felt deliberate, as if it had been sent with a purpose. Frank Walker chose the south-facing edge of a low hill just beyond the town's last scattered claims, far enough that the wind reached him before gossip did. Though gossip, like winter, always found its way eventually. He was an old veteran well past 60, with a body shaped by years of service and labor, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped, as if the weight of remembered marches still pressed down on his spine. His face was deeply lined, not just by age but by habit, sunburns from long days outdoors, old scars that had healed crooked, and a permanent crease between his brows, earned during years when attention meant survival. A thick gray beard framed his jaw, trimmed short out of discipline rather than vanity, and his eyes, pale blue and sharp, carried the calm of a man who had already seen worse than ridicule. He wore the same thing every day, a heavy red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket frayed at the cuffs, patched at one elbow, and unmistakably warm. It was the kind of jacket that announced nothing fashionable and everything practical, a uniform of survival rather than identity. At his side moved Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a silver sable coat darkening along the spine, powerful shoulders, and amber eyes that missed very little. Ranger's ears stood alert even at rest, his posture always half-ready, shaped by loyalty rather than training, though Frank suspected the dog understood more about vigilance than most men in town. The cabin Frank began to build looked wrong from the moment the first walls rose. That was the word people used, wrong, not unsafe, not unfinished, but wrong as though the land itself had rejected it. The walls leaned inward instead of standing straight, giving the structure a squat, defensive look, wider at the base than at the roofline. The roof itself refused simplicity, sloping in overlapping angles rather than forming a clean peak, and 3 sides of the cabin were slowly swallowed by earth, as Frank shoveled soil up against the logs, packing it tight, until only the front wall and part of the roof remained exposed. To passing eyes, it looked like a cabin trying to hide, or perhaps a structure that had lost confidence halfway through its own construction. Compared to the neat rectangular log cabins scattered across the prairie, all straight lines and proud silhouettes, Frank's place resembled a mistake someone had decided to bury rather than fix. The laughter started before the roof was finished. Jack Patterson, whose claim bordered Frank's to the east, made sure of that. Jack was a man in his early 40s, with a strong build softened by comfort rather than age, sandy hair already thinning at the crown, and a mustache he waxed into careful points, as if grooming could substitute for foresight. He had arrived in Montana during a run of mild winters and believed deeply in what had worked once, continuing to work forever. Jack's confidence came easily and loudly, especially around others. He rode past Frank's cabin with visitors whenever he could, reining in his horse, dramatically pointing with a gloved hand, laughing as if he were presenting a circus attraction. He called it a mole-hole, a foreigner's folly, a waste of good timber. Frank had heard worse names shouted with far more hatred behind them, so he said nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was often the most efficient response. Sarah Mitchell came out one afternoon, when the walls were already half buried, riding alone from the boarding house she ran in town. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean with auburn hair, usually pinned into a practical knot beneath her hat, and skin weathered by years of cooking, cleaning, and managing people who rarely listened. Her eyes were quick assessing and carried a sharp intelligence shaped by necessity rather than schooling. She reined in her horse, dismounted, and walked a slow circle around the cabin boots, crunching in the frozen grass. For several minutes she said nothing, her expression unreadable, head tilting slightly as she took in the angles, the dirt piled high against the logs, the narrow entrance taking shape at the front. Finally, she let out a short breath that was almost a laugh and said more to herself than to Frank that she had seen some peculiar things in her life, but this one truly took the prize. There was no cruelty in her tone, only disbelief. Frank nodded once in acknowledgement, returned to his work, and Sarah, after another long look, rode away, shaking her head, already rehearsing the story she would tell over dinner. Others talked too. Martha Crawford, a small woman with soft features and a permanently worried expression, whispered to her husband that Frank seemed kind enough, but that a man who built like that might not be sound in other matters either. These judgments traveled faster than any horse carried on speculation, rather than malice, yet they landed all the same. Frank heard them. He heard everything. But inside his thoughts were elsewhere, measuring distances, remembering cold that cracked wood like gunfire winters, where breath froze inside lungs before it ever reached the air. He had learned those lessons long before Montana. The war had taught him discipline and loss, but winter had taught him respect. He had watched men stronger than himself fail because they trusted appearances. He had slept in shelters that looked solid and felt like coffins once the temperature dropped. When Frank thought of the tidy cabins his neighbors built, single walls, peaked roofs, doors opening straight into living space, he felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with inevitability. He did not see homes. He saw risk. So he dug and packed and layered and worked until his hands bled through his gloves, until Ranger lay nearby with his head on his paws, eyes following every movement, occasionally rising to pace the perimeter, as if guarding the idea of the place itself. At night, when Frank sat alone beside a small temporary fire, the laughter replayed in his mind not as insults, but as echoes of a pattern he recognized. People always laughed at preparation. They mistook quiet for weakness, difference for ignorance. He felt a flicker of something almost like amusement at the thought that one day the same people who mocked his cabin might be grateful for it. He did not dwell on that thought long. Pride had no place in survival. He built because building was the answer, not because vindication might follow. As the weeks passed, and the first real frost locked itself into the ground, the cabin took on its final shape. Half earth, half timber crouched against the hillside like an animal that understood weather. From the road, it looked uglier than ever. From inside, Frank felt a strange sense of rightness settling into his bones. Ranger seemed to feel it too, choosing to sleep near the entrance tunnel, body angled toward the outside ears, twitching at distant sounds, already claiming the space as something worth protecting. The laughter continued, but it had begun to sound thin to Frank, stretched over something untested. Winter was coming, and winter he knew would be the only honest judge. Frank Walker never explained himself, not because he lacked reasons, but because explanation had never saved anyone's life. The prairie outside Great Falls had entered that uneasy pause between autumn and true winter. The ground stiffening each night, the air sharpening its edge, and Frank worked with the quiet urgency of a man who could already hear what others could not. Each morning he rose before the sun, breath fogging in the half-light, Ranger stretching beside him with a low, contented groan before shaking frost from his coat. The dog was 5 years old, broad-chested and powerful, his silver sable fur thickening as the temperatures dropped instinctively, preparing the way Frank did without conscious thought. Frank moved with a methodical rhythm born from old habits, the kind carved into muscle, during years when preparation meant survival and neglect meant casualties. He chose every detail of the cabin with the patience of someone who had learned to distrust shortcuts. The hillside itself became his first ally. Frank studied the slope, watching how rainwater drained after the last autumn storms, noting where frost lingered longest and where sunlight struck even in the weak winter months. When he dug deep, cutting into the earth until the wind no longer reached him, until the ground itself wrapped around the structure like a shield. He laid gravel by hand, hauling it in sacks that bit into his shoulders, then placed flat stones one by one, fitting them together with care. The stone floor was not comfort. It was strategy. Stone stayed dry. Stone held heat. Stone remembered warmth long after the fire faded. As he worked, Frank's thoughts drifted to nights long ago, when cold had crept up from damp ground, stealing strength inch by inch, and he set each stone as if sealing away those memories. The walls rose slowly, not as walls in the way his neighbors understood them, but as layered defenses. Thick pine posts were sunk deep into the soil, their bases buried where frost could not pry them loose. Between these posts, Frank built 2 separate log walls, each carefully fitted, each sealed with a mixture of clay and fine sand he mixed himself. The space between them grew wide enough that a man could almost crawl through it, and Frank filled it in layers never randomly. Dry grass came first, packed just tight enough to trap air. Then clay, cool and heavy, smoothing over the grass like mortar over bone. Then earth, dark and damp-smelling, followed again, by grass, then clay. It was slow, exhausting work, and more than once Jack Patterson rode past, shaking his head, calling out jokes about Frank building a fortress for mice. Jack's voice always carried confidence, the confidence of a man whose beliefs had never been tested by disaster. Frank did not answer. He focused on the rhythm of his hands, the logic beneath the labor. Air trapped in grass resisted cold. Clay blocked moisture. Earth added weight and stability. Together they formed a wall nearly 4 feet thick, a barrier against winter that no laughter could thin. The roof drew the most attention and the harshest mockery. Frank built it heavy, almost brutally, so layering split wood planks over thick beams, then covering them with sheets of dried bark he had stripped and cured during the summer. Over that went blocks of sod cut from the prairie, laid like bricks, roots intact, followed by more bark and more sod, until the roof seemed less like a roof and more like a continuation of the hillside itself. It weighed several tons, and the beams beneath groaned softly as the final layers settled. Frank listened carefully to those sounds, adjusting supports, reinforcing joints, trusting his ear as much as his eyes. He had learned long ago that structures spoke to those willing to listen. When snow fell, he knew it would stay piling high, adding insulation instead of sliding away. He imagined the roof sleeping under white blankets, while other cabins shivered bare against the wind. The entrance was the final insult to his neighbor's sense of propriety. Frank dug a narrow tunnel low enough that even he had to bow slightly to pass through. It led to an inner door before opening into the living space. To Jack Patterson, who stopped one afternoon, to stare openly, it looked like a burrow. To Frank, it was an airlock, a place where cold air would sink and stay trapped, unable to rush into the heart of the cabin. Wind could scream all it wanted outside. Inside it would find no straight path. Ranger took to lying at the tunnel's mouth, nose-lifted ears, twitching, as if he understood the threshold mattered. Not everyone mocked openly. Sarah Mitchell rode out again one cold afternoon, her auburn hair escaping its knot in loose strands around her weathered face. She dismounted slowly this time, boots crunching on frozen soil, and watched Frank work without interrupting. There was something thoughtful in her expression now, curiosity replacing disbelief. She asked no questions, only observed the thickness of the walls, the careful layering, the way Frank tested seals with his bare hands, eyes closed, feeling for drafts. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, less certain. She said it looked like he was building for something worse than the winters they had known. Frank paused, wiped his hands on his jacket, and met her gaze. He said simply that winter did not care what people believed. Sarah nodded once, as if storing the thought away, then mounted her horse and left without another word. Inside the cabin, the heart of the design took shape. Frank began constructing the tile stove at the center of the floor, hauling stones one at a time, stacking them into a massive structure of clay and rock. It took weeks, his hands cracking and bleeding despite the cold, but he worked with a quiet reverence. The stove was not meant to roar with flame all day. It was meant to burn hot and fast, then hold that heat like a memory, releasing it slowly into the room. Frank tested it again and again, adjusting channels inside the stone so smoke would travel long paths before escaping, surrendering its warmth to the mass around it. Ranger lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes following every movement, occasionally lifting his head when sparks snapped, unafraid, trusting. As autumn bled into winter, the laughter from town softened, replaced by speculation. People noticed the woodpile growing beside Frank's cabin, stacked neatly under cover, cord after cord laid with care. They saw him hauling sacks of grain crates, of dried meat jars, of rendered fat, and baskets of root vegetables into storage spaces dug into the hill. Jack Patterson joked that Frank was preparing for the end of the world, but the joke sounded thinner, now less certain. Frank ignored it. He checked seals, tested the stove, and listened to the land. At night, as he sat by the warm stone, Ranger stretched beside him. Frank felt something settle deep in his chest, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with pride. He had done what he could. The rest belonged to winter. The first sign was not the cold, but the silence, a strange thinning of sound that settled over the prairie outside Great Falls. As October drew toward its end, the wind easing as if holding its breath, the sky stretching high and pale like burnished tin. Frank Walker noticed it before dawn, while he stood outside his cabin with Ranger at his side, both of them facing north, both of them still. Frank's instincts, sharpened by war, and winter's alike, tightened in his chest. He had seen this kind of sky before, the kind that pretended calm while gathering violence somewhere beyond sight. Ranger sensed it too. The dog's posture, subtly different, ears angled forward, tail held low but steady, amber eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something to break through. Frank rested a gloved hand on the thick fur at Ranger's neck, feeling the animal's warmth and steady breathing, grounding himself in the present, even as memory whispered warnings. That day passed deceptively mild. In town, people joked about an Indian summer, about luck holding, about winter being late again. Jack Patterson rode past Frank's place near midday, tipping his hat with exaggerated cheer, calling out that Frank might have overbuilt after all if the weather stayed so kind. Jack looked comfortable on his horse cheeks, ruddy mustache stiff with wax, confidence unshaken by anything but inconvenience. Frank nodded politely and returned to his work without answering. He was hauling the last of his firewood inside, stacking it near the stone stove, arranging it by size and dryness, a system that looked obsessive to outsiders, but made perfect sense to him. Inside the cabin, the air already felt different from the outside world, calmer, heavier, insulated, not just by earth and stone, but by intention. He tested the stove again, lighting a hot fire, watching how the stone absorbed the heat, how the warmth lingered even after the flames died down. Ranger lay stretched out nearby, belly up, radiating trust, occasionally opening one eye when a log shifted or cracked. By late afternoon, the light had changed. Clouds crept in from the northwest, thin at first high, and wispy, then thicker, flattening the sky into a dull lid. Frank finished his preparations with deliberate care. He checked the seals along the walls, ran his hands along the interior logs, feeling for drafts. He secured the animals in the small barn, cut into the hillside behind the cabin, murmuring softly as he latched the door. The goat bleating nervously, the chickens settling into uneasy silence. He filled every container he owned with water, setting them inside where they would not freeze. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped fast enough that he could feel it through his boots, the ground stiffening beneath his feet. Frank stood at the edge of the hill one last time, scanning the land, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of isolation press in. If he was wrong, if the storm passed lightly, he would endure another season of laughter. If he was right, the laughter would not matter. The storm announced itself in the night. The wind returned suddenly, not gradually, but as a force slamming into the cabin with a howl that rattled even the thick beams. Snow followed hard and fast, heavy flakes driven sideways, piling against the exposed front wall, sealing the cabin deeper into the hill. By dawn, the world outside had vanished into white chaos. Frank woke fully dressed as he always did in winter, the habit ingrained too deeply to break. Ranger was already on his feet, pacing the tunnel entrance, nose twitching, reacting to the pressure change, the distant roar of the wind. Frank fed the stove, built a hot fire, then sat back as the stone began its slow work warmth, spreading outward like a held breath, finally released. Inside, the temperature climbed steadily, comfortable, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the violence beyond the walls. In town, panic grew with the storm. Jack Patterson's cabin, built light and fast, shuddered under the assault. Wind forced itself through every gap, every imperfect seam, stripping heat from the interior as quickly as Jack could produce it. By the second day, his woodpile was shrinking at an alarming rate, and his wife Ellen, a small woman with pale skin and dark hair pulled tight in a braid, began to show signs of exhaustion and cold. Ellen had never liked winter, had always feared it. Quietly, her nerves, shaped by a childhood, spent moving from place to place, never quite settled. Now fear rose openly in her eyes as she huddled near the fireplace, shivering, despite layers of blankets. Jack tried to joke at first, tried to reassure her with the same confidence that had carried him through easier seasons, but his voice thinned as the cold pressed in. By the third night, the decision could no longer be avoided. Jack had seen Frank's cabin glowing faintly through the storm earlier that day, the only structure that seemed unmoved by the chaos. Pride warred with necessity, but necessity won. He tied a rope between himself and Ellen, wrapping her in his heaviest coat, his hands shaking not just from cold, but from the weight of admitting he had been wrong. They stepped out into the storm, immediately assaulted by wind, so fierce it felt solid breath tearing from their lungs, snow blinding them within seconds. The half-mile journey stretched into something vast and disorienting, the world reduced to noise and pain. They stumbled, fell, rose again, driven forward by the knowledge that turning back meant death. When they finally reached Frank's cabin, Jack pounded on the outer door with numb fists, the sound swallowed by the wind. Frank had been expecting this moment, though he had not named it. He opened the door without hesitation, ushering them into the tunnel. The temperature shift was immediate and shocking warmth enveloping them in layers, the air thick and still compared to the chaos outside. Ellen nearly collapsed, legs buckling, as sensation returned painfully to her frozen hands and feet. Frank guided them inside, seating Ellen near the stove, wrapping her in dry blankets, pressing a warm mug into her hands. He did not lecture, did not gloat. He moved with quiet efficiency, the same way he had on nights long ago when lives depended on steady hands and clear priorities. Word spread quickly, carried by desperation rather than gossip. Before the storm's fourth day ended, others arrived. The Morrison family came first, Harold and Lucy Morrison, both lean and hollow-eyed, their 2 children clinging to them silently. Harold was a quiet man with a permanently furrowed brow, his reserve shaped by years of responsibility he never felt prepared for. Their cabin roof had begun to sag under the weight of snow, the walls groaning ominously. Not long after, an elderly trapper named William Carter appeared, his beard white as frost, his body bent, but stubborn eyes sharp despite his years. He had been caught away from his camp when the storm hit his face raw with frostbite, his voice hoarse but steady. Frank took them all in without comment, rearranging the space, spreading bedrolls, feeding the stove. Ranger watched each newcomer carefully, tail wagging cautiously, then settled among them as if counting heads, ensuring the pack was complete. Inside the cabin, life took on a strange, suspended rhythm. The wind screamed outside, but within the thick walls it was muted, reduced to a distant growl. The stove radiated constant warmth, the stone floor releasing heat slowly into the room. People spoke in low voices, sharing food, sharing silence, each person grappling with the quiet realization that survival had come from the very place they had mocked. Jack sat apart at first, shoulders slumped, mustache drooping, his confidence stripped away by the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. He said they had been wrong. He said the cabin had saved them. Frank listened without interruption, then simply nodded. The storm was not finished yet, but the lesson had already arrived. The storm did not leave quietly. It withdrew like a wounded animal, slow and reluctant, dragging its claws across the land one last time, before releasing great falls back into a silence so deep it felt unreal. When morning finally came, the light was sharp and blinding, reflecting off endless white drifts that swallowed fences, half-buried cabins, and the familiar shapes of the prairie itself. Frank Walker stepped outside his earth-sheltered home for the first time in days. The cold biting, but manageable, the air startlingly still. Ranger padded beside him, paws crunching softly on packed snow, head low, ears turning in all directions, as if the world had changed while they were inside, and in many ways it had. The damage revealed itself slowly. Jack Patterson's cabin stood, but only barely. The door had been ripped from its hinges and now lay twisted several yards away, half buried in snow. Inside, everything was frozen solid blankets, stiff as boards, cookware cracked, chinking, blown out from between logs, so that daylight streamed through the walls like accusation. Jack stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched, his confident posture collapsed inward, mustache uncurled and rimmed with frost. He looked older than his years now, his face drawn tight, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and a realization he could no longer dodge. Ellen stood behind him, wrapped in borrowed layers, her dark braid undone and hanging loose, skin pale but warming, one hand gripping his sleeve as if afraid the ground itself might give way. She said nothing, but her silence carried weight. It was the silence of someone who had nearly slipped beyond fear into something final. Farther out, the Morrison family faced worse. Their cabin roof had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, and wind beams snapped like matchsticks, the structure sagging inward as if bowing in defeat. Harold Morrison moved slowly through the wreckage, tall and thin, his long limbs stiff with cold and fatigue, his brow permanently furrowed deeper than before. Lucy stood nearby, holding their children close, her face red and raw from windburn eyes fixed on the remains of the life they had tried to build. She had always been practical, quiet, the kind of woman who endured rather than complained, but now her hands trembled openly. They would not be returning there anytime soon. Perhaps never. Others emerged from their shelters in similar states, shell-shocked, humbled alive mostly by chance. William Carter, the old trapper, stood upright, despite his age beard crusted with ice, eyes scanning the land with a familiarity born of decades spent listening to it. He said little, only nodded once at Frank, in a gesture that carried respect deeper than words. William had survived because he understood something about nature that many settlers did not. It was not cruel, but it was indifferent, and indifference demanded preparation. In the days that followed, Frank's cabin became something new. Not a refuge from immediate death anymore, but a center of gravity. People came in shifts, warming themselves, sharing what food they had salvaged, resting before returning to the brutal work of digging out and assessing losses. Sarah Mitchell arrived on the second day after the storm broke, walking rather than riding, her boots caked with snow, auburn hair hidden beneath a wool scarf. Up close, the strain showed in her lean face lines, etched deeper by worry for the people she fed and housed in town. She moved through the cabin slowly, hands brushing the thick walls, eyes tracing the low ceiling, the massive stove radiating steady warmth. There was no disbelief left in her expression now, only focus. Sarah had always been observant, a woman shaped by responsibility rather than illusion, and she understood immediately that this place had changed the balance of the community. She asked Frank questions, not mocking, not idle but precise ones. How thick were the walls? How long did the heat last after the fire died? How much wood did it truly take to stay warm? Frank answered patiently. His voice even, his explanations grounded in experience rather than theory. Sarah listened the way a good innkeeper listened, storing information, because lives might depend on it later. Jack Patterson sat near the stove one evening, as the others slept, the fire casting long shadows across his face. Pride had always been easy for him, humility less so. He cleared his throat, fingers twisting together, and finally spoke into the quiet. He admitted they had laughed, admitted they had called the cabin ugly, foolish, foreign, admitted that he had believed good looks and tradition were the same as wisdom. His voice cracked, not with cold, but with the weight of nearly losing everything. Frank stirred a pot of stew slowly, deliberately, letting Jack's words settle without interruption. When Jack finished, Frank did not respond with triumph or anger. He simply said one sentence, calm and steady, as if stating a law of physics rather than an opinion. Judge a house in winter, not in summer. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. No one laughed. No one argued. The sentence did what the storm had done, stripped away illusion. After that, questions came more freely, not just from Jack, but from others who had survived by sheltering in Frank's cabin. They wanted to understand the logic behind the earth-packed walls, the airlock entrance, the stone stove that held heat like a living thing. Frank explained without condescension, using simple language gestures, sometimes letting people feel the warmth stored in the stone floor beneath their palms. He spoke of thermal mass without naming it, of building for the worst day rather than the average one, of treating winter not as an enemy to fight, but a force to accommodate. Ranger moved among them, accepting quiet pats, settling beside children, who leaned into his thick fur, the dog's presence a wordless assurance that safety was real. As weeks passed and the land slowly recovered, the contrast between preparation and assumption became impossible to ignore. Some cabins were repaired, patched just enough to last another season. Others were abandoned entirely. And in the evenings, when the cold returned with familiar insistence, people found themselves drawn back to Frank's place not out of desperation now, but out of trust. The cabin that had once been a joke now represented something sturdier than shelter. It represented humility, learned the hard way, and knowledge earned rather than borrowed. Frank never said, "I warned you." He never needed to. The winter had spoken clearly enough. The years that followed the first great storm changed the rhythm of life around Great Falls in ways no one could fully name at first. Frank Walker did not seek attention yet. Attention found him anyway, carried on boots crunching through snow, and voices lowered with something like respect. Men who once laughed now stood quietly inside his cabin, hands pressed against thick earthen walls, absorbing warmth and lessons at the same time. Frank remained the same measured, disciplined, wrapped in his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, as if it were part of his skin what the world around him adjusted. Jack Patterson was among the first to act on what he had learned. When spring finally loosened winter's grip, Jack tore down what remained of his old cabin and started again digging into his own hillside with a stubborn determination that surprised even himself. His new cabin looked almost as strange as Frank's walls, thicker roof, heavier entrance, awkwardly low. Jack no longer cared how it looked. The storm had burned vanity out of him, leaving behind a man quieter, slower to speak, but far more attentive. Others followed, some eagerly, some reluctantly. Sarah Mitchell became an unexpected bridge between Frank's knowledge and the wider community. She was still tall and lean, her auburn hair now threaded with a few strands of gray, her weathered skin carrying the authority of someone who had fed half the town through lean seasons. She began asking Frank if she could bring people to learn not to gawk, but to understand. Frank agreed without ceremony. He explained when asked, demonstrated when words failed, and refused payment every time it was offered. Knowledge, he believed, was lighter when carried together. Ranger, older now, his muzzle dusted with white, continued his quiet patrols, greeting newcomers with calm acceptance, settling near children, as if instinctively guarding the future. Then came the second winter. It arrived without apology, heavier and colder than the first, as if the land itself had grown impatient with half-learned lessons. Snow fell early and did not stop. Temperatures plunged to depths that froze breath in the air, and winds tore across the prairie with a relentless fury that erased tracks within minutes. This was the winter that stripped away any remaining illusions. Cabins that had barely survived the first storm failed completely now. Roofs collapsed, supplies dwindled, and the distance between safety and death narrowed to the width of a single bad decision. Frank had prepared. In the intervening years, he had expanded his underground living space, carving additional rooms into the hillside with the same patient resolve that had shaped the original cabin. He had doubled his food stores, stacked firewood with near-military precision, and refined his stove so that a few hours of fire could hold warmth through an entire day and night. When the cold descended again, people came sooner this time, not waiting for desperation to force them. Families arrived with children bundled tight, elders leaning on makeshift canes, faces etched with fear, but also trust. Frank took them in as he always had, adjusting sleeping spaces, sharing meals, setting routines that gave structure to the long, dark days. Among those who arrived was a woman named Margaret O'Connell, a widow in her early 50s with iron-gray hair cut short for practicality and eyes sharpened by years of loss. She had lost her husband to illness 2 winters earlier and had learned to survive through stubborn self-reliance. Her small cabin had failed quickly under the new storm, and she arrived at Frank's place with nothing but a pack and a quiet pride that nearly sent her back into the cold. Frank did not argue. He simply opened the door wider and went back to tending the stove. Margaret stayed. Over the weeks that followed, she became an anchor within the crowded shelter, helping organize food, calming frightened children, her sharp humor surfacing in moments of shared exhaustion. She understood, as Frank did, that dignity could coexist with dependence when survival was at stake. The second winter claimed lives across the territory. Livestock froze in the fields. Supply lines failed. Families who had dismissed Frank's methods after the first storm paid dearly now. Yet inside the earth-sheltered cabin, life continued in a muted but steady way. The walls held. The stove breathed warmth into the space. People talked, argued softly, laughed when they could. Ranger slept among them, rising occasionally to reposition himself, counting bodies, as if ensuring no one slipped away unnoticed. Frank watched it all with a calm born not of detachment, but of responsibility. This was what preparation was, for not comfort alone but continuity. When spring finally returned, weak and tentative, it revealed a landscape altered again. Many cabins stood abandoned, their owners gone or relocated closer to town. Frank's place remained partially hidden by earth, unchanged in its purpose, if not in its reputation. He was no longer the odd veteran with the ugly cabin. He was the neighbor people hoped lived nearby, the man whose quiet choices had kept children alive through nights that might have ended everything. Visitors came from farther away now, some riding days to see the cabin for themselves. Frank welcomed them without fanfare, sharing what he knew, refusing to turn survival into spectacle. Years passed. Frank aged, his movements slower, his beard fully white but his habits unchanged. He added a small greenhouse to the south side of the cabin, extending the growing season, bringing fresh greens into winters that still tried their best to kill. Sarah Mitchell married late in life and eventually turned the boarding house over to younger hands, but she never stopped pointing newcomers toward Frank's place when talk turned to winter. Jack Patterson raised his children in a cabin that looked strange from the road, but never once left them shivering at night. Margaret O'Connell stayed through 3 winters, then built her own earth-sheltered coin nearby, strong and simple, a quiet echo of Frank's original design. When Frank Walker finally died, it was not during winter, but in a mild summer, seated outside his cabin, with Ranger's head resting on his knee. He was buried on the hillside above the place he had carved from earth, and effort the land slowly reclaiming him, as it would reclaim the cabin one day. Years later, when newer houses rose and old ones fell, people still spoke of the ugly cabin that had saved lives. Snow buried it season after season, then melted away, leaving behind something deeper than wood or stone. It left behind a way of thinking, a belief that preparation was an act of care, that wisdom could look strange before it proved itself, and that humility was sometimes learned only when the wind was loud enough to silence laughter. In the end, the miracle was never the cabin itself. Wood can rot, stone can crack. Even the strongest walls will someday return to the earth. The real miracle was what moved Frank Walker's hands when no one believed him, an unseen wisdom placed in his heart long before the first snow fell. Some would call it experience. Others would call it instinct. But many of us know another name for it: grace. A quiet guidance from God that whispers before the storm, urging preparation, patience, and compassion when the world is still laughing. God does not always announce his miracles with thunder. Sometimes he hides them in ordinary choices, in a man who builds, when others mock, in kindness, offered without pride, in a door left open when fear says, "Close it." When the winter came, the cabin became a refuge, but it was faith expressed through action that truly saved lives. The Bible reminds us that wisdom cries out before danger arrives, and blessed are those who listen while the skies are still blue. In our daily lives, storms come too. not always as snow and wind, but as illness, loss, loneliness, or moments when everything we trusted begins to shake. This story asks us a simple question. Are we building our lives for fair weather, or for the hardest winter we may face? Preparation is not fear. Kindness is not weakness, and faith is not waiting for a miracle. It is living in a way that makes room for one. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be facing their own storm. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city, your state, or your country. Your words may encourage someone more than you realize. And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing reminders of hope, resilience, and quiet faith. May God bless you, protect your home, steady your heart, and guide your steps, especially when the weather of life turns cold. May His peace rest upon you and those you love. Amen.